The hostel wasn't much to look at, a faded, weather-worn building standing on a forgotten corner of the city. The kind of place that smelled like damp laundry and old wood, where the pipes groaned every time someone flushed. I lived in room 14, just past the second creaking staircase, and the only thing my window overlooked was the old, abandoned playground. I didn't like looking out there, especially at night. The playground was a relic of a different era, with rusted swings hanging limply from their chains and a merry-go-round that creaked whenever the wind caught it. It looked like something out of a horror movie. And then there were the three men. They were always there, sitting on the cracked benches or leaning against the jagged remains of the monkey bars. They weren't just drifters. Something about them was wrong. The tallest one, a gaunt man with a patchy beard, always seemed to be watching the windows of the hostel. His name was Mark, or at least that's what I heard him called. The other two were quieter, blending into the shadows. One had a scar running down the side of his face, and the other was hunched over as if the weight of his own body was too much to bear. I tried to ignore them, but every now and then I'd catch Mark looking directly at me. His gaze was sharp, predatory. It wasn't the kind of look you could brush off. One night, after returning late from work, I found myself frozen at the hostel gate. The playground was unusually quiet. No shuffling figures, no murmured conversations. The bench where Mark usually sat was empty. I couldn't explain it, but I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. Something about the stillness wasn't right. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I caught movement from the corner of my eye. Mark was standing beneath the flickering street lamp outside. He wasn't alone. The scarred man was with him, his face half hidden in the shadows. They were both staring directly at me. I closed my door that night and locked it twice. For the first time since I'd moved here, I kept the blinds down. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease from the night before. The daylight brought a false sense of comfort, like everything sinister had evaporated with the sunrise. The playground looked almost normal under the pale winter sky, though the equipment still cast long, skeletal shadows on the cracked asphalt. The men were back, as if nothing had happened. Mark sat on his usual spot on the bench, peeling the label off a can of beer. The scarred man crouched by the merry-go-round, running his fingers along its chipped paint. The hunched one, I'd taken to calling him the lurker, wasn't in sight. I didn't linger at the window long, their presence always set me on edge. That night, as I lay in bed, the sound started. At first, I thought it was someone in the hostel moving around. There were faint creaks, a low thud, and what sounded like a muffled laugh. Hostels were never quiet places, so I dismissed it. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound wasn't coming from inside the building. It was outside, near the playground. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crept to the window, pulling the blinds aside just enough to peek through. The three men were there, but they weren't sitting. They were standing in a tight circle, their faces illuminated by the faint orange glow of the street lamp. Mark held something in his hands, something dark and heavy. The scarred man was laughing, a wet, choking sound. It took me a moment to realize they were dragging something across the ground. A large, lumpy shape covered in a tattered sheet. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see what it was, but it was too big to be anything normal. I ducked away from the window and clutched the edge of my bed. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I hadn't actually seen anything sinister. But the image of that lump under the sheet stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The noises continued for another hour, low voices, occasional thuds, and once, a high-pitched squeal that made my skin crawl. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. Silence fell over the playground like a heavy curtain. I didn't sleep that night. When I finally stepped outside the next morning, I tried to avoid looking at the playground. But as I passed the gate, something caught my eye, a dark smear on the asphalt, trailing from the merry-go-round toward the edge of the fence. It looked like blood. I swallowed hard and quickened my pace, not daring to look back. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore this forever. Something was happening out there, something I was dangerously close to. By the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. The noises, the smears, the way Mark's eyes seemed to follow me whenever I glanced toward the playground, it all clawed at my mind. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking. But when I spotted a thin bone, a literal bone, poking out of the dirt near the fence, I knew I couldn't pretend this wasn't happening. That afternoon, I stood outside the hostel gate, staring at the playground. I don't even remember deciding to go closer. My feet just started moving. Before I knew it, I was stepping past the sagging fence, my heart thudding so loudly I swore the whole city could hear it. The swings creaked as a cold wind rushed past, but the playground was otherwise still. The three men were nowhere to be seen. I should have felt relieved, but instead, unease settled in my stomach like a stone. I turned to leave, but a voice stopped me.
You looking for something?
Mark's voice. Low, gravelly, and far too close. I spun around, nearly tripping over myself. He stood by the merry-go-round, his hands stuffed into the pockets of a ratty jacket. Behind him, the scarred man was leaning against the monkey bars, watching me with an unsettling grin. The lurker was further back, crouched near the swings, his head tilted like a curious animal. No, I stammered, forcing my legs to stay steady. I was just passing through. Mark took a step closer, his sharp eyes locked on mine.
Not many people pass through here. Especially not hostile folk. You are them?
I nodded, my mouth dry. Yeah. Room 14.
Room 14,
he repeated, like he was committing it to memory. His lips curled into a smile, but there was nothing friendly about it.
Nice view of the playground from there, huh?
I didn't know what to say. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I felt rooted to the spot, like a rabbit caught in a trap. Before I could reply, the scarred man chuckled, a deep, guttural sound. Don't scare the kid, Mark, he said, but the look on his face suggested he was enjoying this. He probably just likes the scenery. The lurker made a sound, a soft huff that might have been a laugh. I couldn't take it anymore. I should go, I said quickly, taking a step back. I didn't mean to bother you. Mark didn't stop me, but as I turned to leave, his voice followed me.
Careful out there, room 14. People around here, they go missing sometimes.
I didn't look back. I practically ran to the hostel, slamming the gate behind me and locking myself in my room. My heart was still pounding as I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I never liked thinking about my mother, but somehow, she was always on my mind in moments like this. She'd been gone for 3 years now. A freak accident, the kind you read about in the news but never think will happen to you. She was crossing the street one evening, carrying groceries, when a car came out of nowhere. The driver never even stopped. After her death, everything fell apart. The house, the savings, the little semblance of normalcy we had, it all disappeared. I'd been forced to sell what little we had left and move into this hostel, scraping by on odd jobs and the occasional freelance gig. It wasn't much of a life, but it was all I had. She used to tell me I had her eyes. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw her there, staring back at me. It was a painful kind of comfort. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mark's words, about the way he'd said missing. It felt like a warning, but also a threat. And then there was the way the scarred man had grinned, like he knew something I didn't. I tried to convince myself they were just messing with me, trying to scare the hostile kid. But the more I thought about it, the less sure I became. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint creak of the merry-go-round. It sounded like laughter. The following night, the air felt heavier, thick with an impending sense of dread. I had barricaded myself in my room, stuffing towels under the door and dragging the bed against it for good measure. My heart hadn't stopped racing since my encounter with Mark and the others. Every noise outside sent a jolt through my chest. The creak of a floorboard, the groan of the wind, it all sounded like them. It was around midnight when I heard it, shouting, desperate and guttural. My curiosity got the better of me. Against every ounce of instinct screaming at me to stay put, I crept to the window and pulled back the edge of the blinds. The 3 men were back at the playground, but they weren't alone. A 4th man, a stranger, was sprawled on the cracked asphalt, thrashing as Mark and the scarred man pinned him down. The stranger's face was twisted in terror, his screams muffled by Mark's hand clamped over his mouth. The lurker stood nearby, holding something that glinted in the pale light of the street lamp. "No," I whispered, backing away from the window. But I couldn't stop watching. The stranger's struggles grew weaker as the scarred man drew something sharp from his pocket, a blade. He raised it high, and before I could process what was happening, he brought it down. The scream that followed was blood-curdling, but it didn't last long. The blade moved again and again until the stranger was silent. I clapped a hand over my mouth, bile rising in my throat. The men didn't stop. They worked quickly, methodically, like they'd done this before. Mark barked orders, the scarred man laughed, and the lurker, he just stared, his hollow eyes locked on the mangled remains. I couldn't look away as they began to tear into the body, their hands and mouths slick with blood. The sound of flesh being torn, the wet crunch of bones, it was nauseating, inhuman. I felt my knees buckle, but before I could collapse, flashing red and blue lights lit up the street. The police. For a moment, I thought it was over. Relief washed over me as 2 officers stepped out of their car, their hands hovering near their holsters. But the relief didn't last. The officers approached cautiously, shouting commands.
"Step away. Hands where we can see them."
But Mark didn't flinch. He simply smiled, his bloodied face illuminated by the harsh lights. The scarred man whispered something to the lurker, and then everything happened at once. The lurker lunged at one of the officers, moving faster than I thought possible for someone his size. The man didn't even have time to draw his gun before the lurker's knife plunged into his neck. Blood sprayed as the officer fell to the ground, clutching at the wound. The second officer fired his weapon, the gunshots echoing through the street, but he missed. Mark was on him in an instant, knocking the gun from his hands and slamming his head into the ground. I watched in horror as the 3 men descended on the officers, tearing into them just as they had the stranger. One of them, the scarred man, lifted the severed head of the first officer and howled like an animal, his voice reverberating through the night. Then, to my utter disbelief, he turned toward the hostel. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No, no, no." He hurled the head with terrifying accuracy. It struck the side of my window with a sickening thud, leaving a bloody smear on the glass. I stumbled back, my hands trembling, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced, screaming at me to run, to hide, to do something. But it was too late. The sound of the front door being kicked and echoed through the hostel. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. I scrambled to push the bed further against the door, but my hands were slick with sweat, and my strength was failing me.
"Room 14.
Mark's voice drawled from the hallway.
Told you I'd remember."
The door shook as they pounded on it. I pressed myself against the far wall, my chest heaving. The pounding grew louder, more frantic, until finally, the door gave way. The bed slid aside as Mark and the others burst into the room, their faces twisted with bloodlust. "No!" I screamed, clawing at the walls, but they were on me in an instant. Mark grabbed me by the collar, yanking me forward with terrifying strength. The scarred man laughed as he bound my wrists with a length of rope, his bloody hands smearing my shirt. The lurker just stared, his empty eyes boring into mine.
"You'll do nicely,"
Mark said, his grin widening.
"Plenty of meat on you."
They dragged me out of the room, down the stairs, and into the cold night air. I kicked and screamed, but it was useless. Their grip was iron, unyielding. As they hauled me toward the playground, I realized with sickening clarity that I was next. The cold night air bit at my skin as they dragged me across the street, through the desolate playground, and into the darkness beyond. I twisted and thrashed, screaming for help, but the city was asleep, indifferent. My captors didn't flinch. Mark's grip was iron, his fingers digging into my arm, while the scarred man laughed at my struggles. The lurker followed silently, his hollow eyes fixed on me like a predator savoring its prey. We came to an old, crumbling building on the edge of an industrial zone, a squat, looming structure that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The windows were shattered, the walls scarred with graffiti and grime. It reeked of mildew, rot, and something far worse. They forced me through a rusted door, its hinges screaming in protest. The inside was worse than I could have imagined. The air was heavy with the metallic stench of blood, mixed with the sour odor of unwashed bodies and decay. The dim glow of a single bulb swung from the ceiling, casting jagged shadows on the walls. I caught glimpses of things, piles of bones, some stripped clean, others still clinging to scraps of flesh. Dirty tools lay scattered on a table, knives, saws, hooks, all stained dark red. This was no home. It was a slaughterhouse.
Welcome.
Mark said, his voice dripping with mockery.
Hope you like the place. You're gonna be spending a lot of time here.
He shoved me forward, and I stumbled, landing hard on the filthy floor. The scarred man yanked me up by the rope around my wrists, laughing as I struggled. He's got some fight in him, he said, licking his lips. I like that. Mark smirked.
Not for long.
They dragged me down a narrow hallway, the walls closing in like a vice. The faint sound of muffled sobbing reached my ears, and my blood turned to ice. It was coming from behind a heavy, bolted door at the end of the hall. No, I whispered, digging my heels into the ground. Please, don't. The lurker stepped forward, shoving me so hard I nearly fell. Mark pulled a key from his pocket, unlocking the door with a metallic scrape.
In you go,
he said, his grin widening. The door swung open, revealing a room that made my heart stop. It was small, barely bigger than a closet, with cracked concrete walls and a single, flickering light bulb overhead. The floor was stained dark with blood, and the air was thick with the smell of sweat, filth, and fear. But it was the people inside who truly shattered me. There were 3 of them, huddled in the corner like wounded animals. A woman in her 30s, her face gaunt and pale, cradled her leg, or what was left of it. Her right leg ended in a jagged stump just below the knee, the bandages around it soaked through with blood. Beside her sat a teenage boy, his arm missing from the elbow down, the exposed flesh crudely stitched. The third was an older man, his eyes hollow, his body riddled with scars. His left ear was gone, his face a patchwork of old wounds. They looked up at me as I was thrown into the room, their expressions a mix of pity and despair. The door slammed shut behind me, the lock clicking into place. I scrambled to my feet, pounding on the door. Let me out. I screamed, my voice cracking. Let me out. Mark's laughter echoed from the other side.
Get comfortable, room 14,
he said.
You're on the menu soon enough.
Their footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving me alone with the other prisoners. My breathing came in ragged gasps as I backed into the corner, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. Hey, the woman's voice snapped me out of my panic. She was staring at me, her eyes tired but sharp. Stop wasting your energy. They won't come back until they're ready. What is this? I stammered, my voice trembling. Who are you? She sighed, leaning back against the wall. Prisoners, like you. Or what's left of us. The boy, his voice barely a whisper, added, They take pieces. Keep you alive as long as they can. Makes the meat fresher. This can't be happening. This can't be real. It's real, the older man muttered, his voice gravelly. You better hope they take you quick. I slid to the floor, my body trembling. The horror of it all was too much. My gaze drifted to the bloodstains on the floor, to the crude carvings on the walls, names, dates, desperate pleas for help. I felt trapped, like a rat in a maze, with no way out. But then I noticed something, a small vent in the corner of the room, partially obscured by grime. It was too small for an adult, but maybe if I could pry it open, there was a chance. A slim, desperate chance. As I sat there, trembling and staring at the vent, one thought burned in my mind. I wasn't going to die here. The next day, or maybe it was night, time blurred in this hellhole. They came for the old man. Mark unlocked the door with his usual smirk, flanked by the scarred man and the lurker. The old man didn't resist. He just stood, shoulders slumped, and shuffled forward as if he'd already accepted his fate. He didn't look back at us as they led him away. I heard his screams minutes later. They didn't last long. The remaining three of us sat in heavy silence. The woman, the one missing a leg, introduced herself as Sarah. The boy, barely 16, was named Ethan. Both looked at me like I had the answers, but I didn't. I was just as terrified as they were. "They'll come for us next," Sarah said, her voice flat. "We can't wait here to die." I nodded, staring at the vent in the corner of the room. I had spent hours studying it, thinking about how to use it to escape. "I've been looking at that vent," I said quietly. "It's small, but if we can get it open..." Ethan's eyes lit up with hope. "We could crawl through. Maybe find a way out." Sarah grimaced. "I won't fit. Not with this." She motioned toward her mangled leg. "But if you can find something, anything, to help us." Before we could say more, the door unlocked again. This time, they came for Ethan. He screamed, clawing at the floor as they dragged him out. "Please, no! Don't let them take me. Don't let them," his cries cut off as the door slammed shut, leaving Sarah and me alone in the suffocating silence. Hours passed, maybe longer. I couldn't stop picturing Ethan's terrified face. The sound of his screams haunted me, each one piercing through the heavy walls. I clenched my fists, refusing to sit by any longer. "It's now or never," I said to Sarah, my voice trembling but determined. She nodded. "Get the vent open. I'll help as much as I can." Using a jagged piece of metal I'd found wedged in the wall, I pried at the screws holding the vent cover in place. It was slow, grueling work, but eventually, the cover came free. The opening was just wide enough for me to squeeze through. "Help me up," Sarah said, gritting her teeth. "I'll go first." With some effort, I hoisted her into the vent. She dragged herself forward, her breathing ragged but determined. I followed close behind, the metal edges scraping against my arms as I crawled through the narrow passage. The vent was dark and suffocating, the air thick with dust and rot. Every creak of the metal made my heart race. We moved slowly, painfully aware of every sound we made. Eventually, we reached a fork in the vent. I paused, unsure which way to go. That's when I heard it. A voice echoing faintly through the metal walls.
"Hear that?
It was Mark, his tone laced with amusement.
Rats in the vents."
They knew. Suddenly, the vent shook violently. Something slammed against it, and I heard Mark's laughter, followed by the lurkers' grunts. They were trying to force us out. "Hurry!" I hissed to Sarah, pushing her forward. We scrambled through the maze of vents, the sound of our pursuers growing louder. Just as we reached an opening, a grate that led into another room, one of them caught up. A hand shot through the vent behind us, grabbing Sarah by the ankle. She screamed, kicking wildly, but the grip was unrelenting. I didn't think, I just acted. Using the jagged metal piece, I stabbed at the hand, the blade sinking into flesh. Mark, or maybe the lurker, howled in pain, and the grip loosened. We tumbled out of the vent and into a cluttered, blood-soaked room. Tools and bones littered the floor, and the stench was overpowering. Before we could catch our breath, the door burst open. The scarred man charged in, his eyes wild. "Run!" Sarah shouted, shoving me toward the hallway. I hesitated, but she shook her head. "I can't move fast enough." "Go!" "No," I said, my voice breaking. But there was no time to argue. The scarred man lunged at us, and Sarah threw herself at him, knocking him off balance. "Go!" she screamed again, her voice filled with both desperation and resolve. I ran. The hallway was a labyrinth of horrors, each turn revealing more signs of their twisted depravity. I could hear Mark and the lurker closing in, their footsteps pounding like thunder. Adrenaline drove me forward until I stumbled into what must have been their main room. Mark was there, blocking the only exit. His face was twisted into a snarl, blood dripping from a wound on his arm, my handiwork from the vent.
You're a fighter.
He said, his voice low and dangerous.
I like that.
The scarred man appeared behind me, dragging a bloodied and limp Sarah. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. She put up a good fight, he sneered, tossing her to the ground like a discarded rag. I clenched the metal shard in my hand, my rage drowning out my fear. You're monsters, I spat. Mark laughed.
Maybe. But monsters always eat.
He lunged at me, and I swung the shard with all my strength. It caught him across the face, opening a deep gash. He roared in pain, but I didn't stop. I stabbed again, this time plunging the shard into his chest. He staggered, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing to the floor. The scarred man snarled and charged, but I was ready. Grabbing a heavy bone saw from a nearby table, I swung it at his head. The blade struck true, and he fell, blood pooling beneath him. I turned to Sarah, but she shook her head weakly. Go, she whispered. Finish it. I hesitated, tears streaming down my face, before nodding. I'm sorry, I choked out, then ran. I burst out of the building, gasping for air. The cool night breeze hit my face, but I didn't stop running until the hostel was in sight. I stumbled into my room, locking the door behind me. My hands were trembling, my mind racing. It was over. They were dead. I was alive. For weeks after that night, I lived like a ghost. Every sound made me jump. The creak of floorboards, the hum of the pipes, even the distant laughter of people outside, it all felt like it could turn into something sinister at any moment. But gradually, the world around me began to normalize again, as though the horrors of that abandoned building had been nothing but a fever dream. I quit my job, too shaken to function at work, and avoided the playground altogether. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? Even if I did tell, I doubted they'd look beyond my wide eyes and trembling hands. Instead, I buried it deep, trying to move on. But moving on was easier said than done. The nights were the hardest. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over. The sounds wouldn't leave me, the wet crunch of flesh, the screams of the others. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah's pale face, her whispered go, the blood pooling around her lifeless body. The images haunted me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I started sleeping with a chair wedged under the doorknob. I didn't trust the lock anymore. I couldn't bring myself to throw away the makeshift blade I'd used that night, even though the sight of it made my stomach churn. It sat on my bedside table, a grim reminder of what I'd done and what I'd survived. Months passed, and life went on, even if it felt like mine was frozen in time. The hostel became just a place to sleep, a temporary shelter until I could save enough to move far, far away. I avoided my neighbors, kept my head down, and spent my days locked in my room, pretending the world didn't exist. The nightmares still came, but I told myself it was over. The three of them were dead. I was safe. And then, one night, everything shattered. It started like any other evening. I was sitting in bed, eating instant noodles and half watching the evening news. The anchor was droning on about the usual, local crime, politics, weather, but then, the screen shifted to a live segment. I saw the headline. Survivor found in abandoned building, local police investigating gruesome crime scene. My chopsticks froze midair. On the screen was the building. That building. The one I'd escaped from. My heart pounded in my chest as they showed footage of investigators swarming the area, carrying bags of evidence and taking photos. The camera cut to a reporter standing outside a hospital, her expression grim. A survivor was found earlier today in the basement of the abandoned building, she said. The man, who has not yet been identified, was severely injured but alive. Authorities believe he may be connected to a string of disappearances in the area. The screen shifted again, and my blood turned to ice. It was him. The lurker. He looked almost unrecognizable. His gaunt face was paler than ever, his hollow eyes even darker. He was lying in a hospital bed, his body wrapped in bandages, but there was no mistaking it. It was him. The reporter continued, but I barely heard her. My ears were ringing, my vision tunneling as I stared at the screen. Doctors say the man is in stable condition and will be transferred to police custody once he recovers. Authorities are hoping he can provide answers about the horrors uncovered in the building. And then it happened. The camera cut to the lurker again, and for a moment, I thought it was just a replay. But no! He turned his head toward the camera, his thin lips curling into a smile. His voice was raspy, barely above a whisper, but I heard it as clearly as if he were standing in my room.
Well,
He said, his eyes glinting with malice,
apartment 14.
The screen flickered back to the anchor, but I didn't hear what they said. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind raced as I stared at the TV, the words echoing in my head. Apartment 14. He remembered. I jumped up, grabbing the remote and turning off the TV, but it was too late. The fear was back, more visceral than ever. My gaze darted to the window, the door, the shadows in the corners of the room. Was he coming for me? Did he know where I was? How much time did I have? I locked every window, barricaded the door, and sat on the floor with the blade in my hand, trembling. My breaths were shallow, my pulse deafening. He was alive. Somehow, he was alive. And he was coming for me.